Hey folks, if you're familiar with this YouTube channel, you'll know that I have a more or less Marxist worldview. I've studied Marx. I generally advocate that the major means of production be held in public. I'm not a fan of capitalism. I do believe in historical progress and the general historical materialist understanding of world history and human civilization. But I figured, as kind of a compliment to Karl Marx, I would make a video about what Karl Marx got wrong. And I say that that's a compliment because Karl Marx, this was not religion. He didn't write it and it was holy truth because he said it. Karl Marx was all about polemics. You read a lot of his writing, he's constantly arguing with people, different socialists, different analysts of history, different philosophers. He's constantly arguing with people. He had no problem with back and forth debate and polemics. And if Karl Marx were alive today, he would want people to be engaging with his writings, not holding them up and just quoting them at other people, but engaging with them and seeing how they hold up against the real world. He argued that his form of socialism was what he called scientific socialism. It wasn't religious or utopian socialism. And so if Karl Marx were alive today, he would want people to be engaging with him, saying what he got right, what he got wrong. So in that spirit, I'm going to go over a few things that Karl Marx got wrong. The main thing, I would say, that Karl Marx got wrong was about how he viewed the emerging capitalist economies of Western Europe, in Britain, France, Germany, the way he viewed them in relation to the world and world history. Karl Marx understood that history was like a train. It was speeding forward. First you had hunter-gatherer civilization, then feudalism and slavery, and then from the ashes of the decaying feudalism, you got the capitalist revolutions. And Marx predicted that out of these capitalist societies that were emerging in Western Europe, Britain, the United States, also, but also, France, Germany, especially Germany. The Communist Manifesto ends with pointing toward Germany. He believed that these were the countries that would have the socialist revolution. At the time he died, Europe was setting in for a pretty big economic crisis, or a long-term state of economic downturn from the 1870s to the 1890s. And Marxism, began to rapidly spread during the final years of Marx's life and in the direct aftermath. And up into the 1890s, you see the widespread, growth of Marxist parties. However, by about 1900, 1910, it becomes clear that Marxist revolution in the Western capitalist countries, and as Marx predicted it would be factory workers located in the Western capitalist countries, that they would rise up and seize control of their factories, seize control of the means of production, and that would be socialism. That socialism would come from the Western world because capitalism had first come to the Western world. It made sense that he viewed the Western countries as being further along in the historical advance, and so they would have socialist revolutions first. And on that basis, mind you, Karl Marx supported the colonization of India by the British. He thought, okay, this is awful. The British are committing horrendous crimes, but they're bringing capitalism. They're bringing a more advanced form of civilization to India. Karl Marx supported the USA in invading Mexico. Why? He thought, well, they're bringing a more advanced system. And it takes Lenin to explain why that did not happen, that Marx's prediction was not correct, because the capitalist trusts and conglomerates, the banking institutions that came to dominate over the industrial institutions, they became imperialists, and that capitalism based in Western countries, it didn't just stop at its borders, it expanded onto a global level and became imperialism. And as a result, around the 1890s, you saw an increase in the standard of living of workers based in Western countries, what they called the skilled workers in the USA, the construction trades, various quote-unquote skilled workers in Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere. Because the capitalists of their country were expanding across the globe, you see the skilled workers, or those that are in guilds or in crafts unions, you see them start to see a really big increase in their standard of living. And as their standard of living increases, they don't really want a revolution, and they feel less revolutionary. And the socialist parties that they had organized and the labor unions associated with these skilled workers in Western countries become softer. They don't really want a revolution. So the revolution doesn't happen because capitalism is expanding onto the global stage. And as a result of that, the global Marxist movement enters what they call the Crisis of Marxism, in response to the fact that Marx's prediction about a revolution in the Western countries doesn't happen. And you get two responses. On the one hand, you get the emergence of social democracy. Edward Bernstein. These forces that say basically capitalism is just gradually evolving into socialism. Look, they change the laws, all the male workers get to vote, universal male suffrage, they're creating public education. And socialism and capitalism are not two distinct stages, that capitalism just kind of gradually transforms into socialism one step at a time. Edward Bernstein, who was the founder, he's actually the person who coined the term revisionism and called himself a revisionist of Marxism. He said that essentially the movement was everything and the goal was nothing. And furthermore, you get a lot of these social democrats and Marxists who responded this way and saying that you didn't need a revolution. You get them saying that the Western capitalist countries are the most advanced, and they should, and they agreed with Marx that the British should colonize India, and that the USA should take over Mexico and seize Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and Southern California from Mexico, right? They should do this because look, this is bringing a more advanced system. So that's the emergence of social democracy. On the other hand, you have the emergence of Bolshevism and Lenin. And it was Lenin who said that capitalism was becoming imperialism and dividing and stratifying the working class within the Western countries. And as a result of that socialism would not emerge from the West, but from the East. And that countries in the oppressed world, countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, countries like Russia, whose ability to develop had been blocked by these Western capitalist countries that wanted to maintain a monopoly, Lenin maintained that it was these countries that would have socialist revolutions. Instead of it being the most technologically and economically advanced countries, it would be those countries that were being held back and were unable to advance. So Marx was wrong. He predicted that the socialist revolutions would happen in the advanced countries, and it was the opposite. It happened in the countries that weren't able to become advanced because the Western capitalist monopolies were holding them back, and it didn't happen in the Western countries because the working class was divided, and because a layer of labor aristocrats or labor aristocracy was created of workers who identified with their bosses because they had higher wages and better living conditions than people in the Third World. They aligned with their bosses in colonizing the Third World and thought of themselves as superior to the people in the Third World, and were not having a layer of solidarity, and were also hostile to the lower income workers within their own country. They thought they were superior. So that is what Lenin was correct about recognizing that Marx was wrong. And when Marx analyzed the British colonization of India, he was wrong about that too. The British weren't going into India and helping India to become a modern capitalist country. What the British did in India was they burned down all the textile mills, and they held back industrial development in India. Marx also was wrong about the fact that he thought that the USA was bringing capitalism to the parts of Mexico that were seized during the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, during the Mexican-American War. And in reality, what the USA was doing was expanding its most primitive and barbaric section, the slave economy. This was a war for slavery. It was a war to help try and attempt to preserve the slave system. So Marx was wrong on those points. And, Karl Marx was right about a lot of things, but he was clearly wrong in how he viewed the relationship between Western capitalist countries in the world. And in the aftermath of his life, the decades immediately following his life, that played out very clearly. What else was Marx wrong about? Marx argued that that all nationalism was inherently reactionary. He said workers of the world unite. He did not believe in any organization on the grounds of nationality. And he argued that workers should simply identify as workers and that nations should just be disregarded. However, even Marx, his views started to change in the final years of his life. In the final years of his life, he was living in Britain, and he became a big supporter of the Irish people in fighting for their independence. And he started to recognize that the Irish people might fight for their independence on the basis of being Irish and not British or English. They might fight for their independence on the basis of being Roman Catholics, but that was still a progressive struggle, and that this idea that it was simply the workers and the bosses, that nations didn't exist, Marx himself started to question that in the final years of his life. And he was clearly wrong. And in fact, most of the socialist revolutions that have happened throughout world history have actually happened on the basis of nationalism. The Russian Revolution is an exception to that. But other than the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, Korean Revolution, Vietnamese, Cuban, the Bolivarian revolutions of Latin America, the Ba'ath socialist revolutions of the Arab world, they've all happened on the basis of nationality. They've argued that for a country to start developing, it needs to break out of the domination and control of the Western capitalists, and the working class has been the leader in the revolutions, that the capitalists of those countries are so weak that the working class becomes the vanguard in fighting for the liberation of the nation. And, Lenin and especially Stalin understood that, but Marx himself was wrong about that. And I just want to critique Marx on one final point, which is that if you read Marx, Marx was very good at understanding economics and understanding class forces and how people benefit and how people don't benefit and how some groups struggle against others. He analyzed the Civil War very brilliantly, understanding that northern capitalists were fighting against the southern slave system, and he very brilliantly understood that. But you have to remember that Karl Marx was doing most of his work in Britain, and he was working at the British Museum, and this was the age of Charles Darwin. This was the period, just shortly after Marx. You have the rise of Sigmund Freud, and that this kind of mindset, what people might call, the mindset of that period, the Romantic period, this belief that human beings are animals, essentially, and that human beings aren't special, they don't have souls, they're not special, they're simply animals, and they respond to pleasure and pain and stimulation. That comes across in Marx. You can see Marx kind of viewing human beings as an animal. And Marx, even in some of his letters, he finds himself asking himself, why am I doing this, right? He sees human beings as simply these creatures that go through the world seeking pleasure and avoiding pain and acting strictly in their economic interest. So how do you get a Marx or a Lenin or a Che Guevara? How do you get people whose economic interest is one thing, but they go against it and they strive to be part of something bigger? And that Marx himself doesn't seem to recognize what you might call the spiritual aspect of man, or of humanity, this idea that human beings are capable of working against their own economic interests for what they believe to be a higher good or a higher form of morality. And Marx, because he has this strict, economically focused view, because he's working in Britain, which is, the home of, the British Empire and the rise of, terms like survival of the fittest and social Darwinism, he's in an atmosphere where people, it's considered revolutionary. It's considered a breakthrough in the modern world in which, the church and state are being separated and science is being heralded. He thinks it's such a breakthrough to view human beings as just animalistic, and he was clearly wrong about that. That, throughout the history of the 20th century, even in Marx's day, you see a lot of people acting in the interest of something that is higher and a drive to achieve something and a higher morality. And furthermore, part of the problem with capitalism is that capitalist societies gradually increase what you might call alienation. Marx wrote extensively about alienation, but as he's writing about alienation, he's not really understanding that alienation has a spiritual quality to it. And that a socialist society could possibly have issues with alienation. And the fact that people being ripped apart from each other, that this is about something deeper than economics. So overall, Marx was correct. He understood how capitalism functioned. He understood capitalism better than the capitalists did. His book Capital is brilliant and basically explains the modern economy, about wealth centralizing in the hands of a few, about the great advances into technology leading to greater poverty, about the big contradictions of capitalism. He understands, the worker and the capitalist. He understands the solution, which is society seizing control of the major means of production and operating them in a rational way and not for the benefit of some capitalists so that civilization can advance. He's brilliant. And the Chinese Revolution and the Russian Revolution before it, in which both of these countries were impoverished and became world superpowers by taking control of the means of production, they very much show that Marx was correct. But Marx is not above criticism. Marx is not a god. He's not infallible. He's a human being. He's a social scientist who understood some aspects of how the world worked. He was right about a lot of things, but on these points, Marx was wrong, and so I will say that. As someone who learned a lot from Karl Marx, someone with vast amounts of respect for Karl Marx, I will say that Karl Marx was wrong on those points. And I'd like to think that if Marx were alive today, he would probably look back at world history and agree with me and say, I was right about a lot of things, but I was wrong about a few things. And I will say the same thing about myself, mind you. I've made some mistakes before. I've said things that I regret. I've taken political positions that I no longer take. That's part of being human. And I think we should all be willing to recognize both our own mistakes and the mistakes of our idols, as well as the mistakes of those we disagree with strongly.